and we are off. So good evening and welcome again to our Frontiers for Credit wraparound workshops. We're happy to have you here. Tonight, I'm really happy to welcome Amy Curran once again. She presented once and she was such a hit, we brought her back for a second time, and she is going to share with you some really great information on navigating the college process for students with accommodated needs. It's a lot different than it is in high school, and Amy can tell you all the ins and outs and give you tips so that you can better prepare your student for the college journey. So I am going to mute myself and turn off my video, but I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, please add them in there and we will be sure to answer all your questions at the end of this program. So thank you so much.
All right, all set. All right, hi everybody. My name is Amy Curran. I'm the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services here at WPI. And tonight, obviously, we're going to be talking about navigating the college process for your student, your children that have any kind of accommodated needs during their high school time and how that transfers onto a college campus. I'll be talking specifically about WPI because obviously that's where I work. All campuses do things a little bit differently, so this is very much geared towards our home campus here. There's a few slides we'll go through about the differences between high school and college, how the law changes, and then I have about 6 or 7 slides about the most commonly asked questions that my office gets around this time of year as students are matriculating in or thinking about colleges to go to for next year. And then after that, we'll talk about, we'll open the room up obviously for questions that you might have. So let's get started. All right. Hold on a second here, whoops, there we go. All right, so the first thing that we want to talk about is how does high school change versus college? What are the big changes? In high school, as you know, navigating that with your student, that there's structure built into the assignments. Teachers build in short-term deadlines. There's a lot of reminders for students about deadlines and assignments. It's common practice to do a lot of that reminding in the classroom setting, or perhaps in a learning resource room or some sort of pull-out section that a student might go to. Test review is often built into the class time, as well as review for assignments, or actually assignment time to get assignments done, or often there's time for that in the classroom setting. Also in high school, a teacher will regularly check in with students and kind of say, hey, come and meet with me, let's talk about this. Or sometimes some teachers I hear from high school like actually say, no, we have to meet and we have to talk about this. A lot of that changes. It very much shifts once you get to a college setting. Students really create their own structure. They are given a course of action. They've got 3 or 4 courses that they're in, and that is their structure that they're creating on their own. Students get deadlines from the syllabus and online sites. At WPI, we use an online platform called Canvas. Professors will either hand out a paper syllabus, maybe not so much now during pandemic, but in general, a paper syllabus, or sometimes online, and that's got all of the information in it. And some professors will go back and look at that information with their students again. Other professors hand it out on the first day, and it is entirely up to the student to go and revisit that again and remember and plot out when is the exam, when is the test, when is the assessment, when is the project. So it really varies. There is no set way that professors do this. It varies from class to class, professor to professor. Students are expected to take time to study outside of class and complete their assignments outside of the classroom. Really, most of your time spent in a classroom on a college setting is lecture and projects and working and doing the work that's assigned to you in the class, but a lot of the material that needs to be passed in that's going to be graded is being done on your own time outside of a classroom setting. And then finally, professors will suggest open office hours. Each professor will have time where students can come and meet with them during the week, Tuesdays from 10 to 12, or Thursdays from 5 to 7. And those are suggested times, but the student really determines the agenda of the meeting. The professor isn't going to be, sitting there waiting for students and saying, okay, here's what we're going to be talking about during our meeting. Their open office hours are for students to come in and navigate what they would like to talk to the professor about, as opposed to vice versa. Another change is the law. This is a big one. A lot of families don't realize that the law changes once you leave high school and come into a college setting. The law that you are covered under for accommodations changes. In high school, students are protected under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and FAPE, which is a free and public education. In both of those cases, the school identifies the student, whether it's a resource teacher or a guidance counselor or an adjustment counselor or a school psychologist. They work in tandem with the families to say that this student needs these kinds of supports in a classroom setting. And then that's when an IEP or 504 plan is put in place. There's individually designed instruction, modifications and accommodations put in place for students in a high school setting. And then similar to in the vein of IEPs and 504s, there's a lot of benchmarks for progress. That is very much in the high school channel. Once you move over into college, the law changes to students are now protected under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The student is responsible for disclosing. Professors do not have access at all to students' files. That is solely in my office on our online database. We do not share diagnosis with professors. We do not share any personal information other than what the approved accommodations are. So it's really up to the student to kind of have those kinds of conversations with professors. We do have our students send out electronic versions of accommodation letters. That's how professors know that they're registered with our office. And that's how they also know what accommodations are put in place. But the professor is not privy to any private information. Oftentimes, IEP and 504 plans are not sufficient documentation. Additional documentation might be needed. The reason for that is that many accommodations that are put in place in a high school setting are not applicable in a college setting. A good example of that would be a modified assignment or an extra 4 days to complete an assignment to pass it in, or the ability to only take one exam per day, especially during midterms. Those are definitely more high school driven accommodations than college accommodations. So that's why the documentation changes a little bit, because we need the documentation to speak to college appropriate accommodations. And then oftentimes IEPs and 504s, obviously you have to renew them. You're supposed to renew them. Your school district is supposed to renew them every 3 years. But in my office, we often see them from 5, 6, 7 years previous to when they start college. And that's when we would need new documentation, simply because a lot of the scales that are given to students are the adolescent scales, and we need students to have the documentation that reflect the adult scales. So that's why, but we work with families about that, because we know that sometimes it's not easy to get documentation. We know it costs a lot of money. We don't want to put an undue burden on parents and families and students, but we also need to make sure the accommodations being looked at are college appropriate. So it's definitely an interactive process that we have. You can find out more about that when and if your child comes to WPI, and we talk about the intake process. But moving on to another way how college is different than high school as far as the law is that students are entitled to reasonable and appropriate accommodations, meaning what worked in high school might not work in college. Another good example of that I think sometimes people get concerned about is preferential seating. I see that on a ton of documentation that comes in from high school, whereas in a college setting, it's not really an accommodation that needs to be put in place. We do have to put it in place for certain disabling conditions, but it's more often that students can just pick their seats at the beginning of the school year. Again, it's very much an interactive process, and we just need to wait to see what the documentation says. Lastly, under the law, how college differs from high school is the access to academic experience. Students are setting the tone for their own academic experience. There's a lot of resources on a college campus, but instead of it being housed all in one building like your high school, it's now housed all over campus. There's academic help in my office, there's academic advising, there's the registrar's office, there's departmental help, there's help within different tutoring groups on campus. And so it's really up to the student to navigate where to get that help. And so that's a big jump for some students, but that's why offices like mine are here to help navigate those changes. So that's a lot of information, but it's important to talk about so that way people aren't shocked and amazed when they come to college and say, well, what do you mean that this doesn't work? And what do you mean that this looks different? It's just important to think about. All right, so we'll jump right into our questions, just because these are the most frequently asked questions that we have that I see come through email and over the phone. So we'll just talk about them. Question number 1, to disclose or not disclose. When applying to WPI, should a student share that they have a disability and may be seeking accommodations? That is 100% an individual decision. Some students feel very empowered by their disability. Some students don't care who knows it and they want to advocate for themselves and they share that information. Some students don't want to share that information and they want to step away from maybe some of the accommodations they had in the high school setting and they want to try college on their own and see what it's like without accommodations. It is totally up to the comfort level of the student, their family, meet together, talk to each other about that. Regardless of whether you disclose or not, the services that are offered in my office or other accessibility offices on other campuses is always there for students. There is no finite time that you have to get in touch with us by. Accommodations can be put in place anytime. One thing that's important to note that I don't think a lot of students take into consideration is that they might not disclose during the application process. They might say, I don't want to, but someone who's writing their letter of recommendation might disclose on their behalf, or might share something like, this student overcame, has worked so hard keeping their ADHD in line and becoming someone who really works on their time management skills. So it's important for students to talk to the people that are writing their letters of recommendation, because if that is mentioned, that information will eventually make its way to my office from admissions. And I might reach out to the student and say, hey, I see that you had accommodations in high school. Would you like to have them in college? So again, it's very much a conversation you have to have as a family, as well as with, the people that are writing your letters of rec, and then go from there. It's very individual. Nothing works for everybody. It goes anyway. All right, next question. First contact. How does the student find out about services available? My screen is frozen, sorry. How do students find out about the services available at the college or university they are considering? The who, what, when, where, why. The first step that you want to take is you want to, do a search on the college campus that you're looking at and look up something like either disability services or accessibility services or student support services. Those are the most common names for offices like mine. And that's who you want to contact, usually probably starting at the end of junior year after you're starting to look at colleges, and you want to start to call those offices and find out about what are the documentation requirements, what kind of support is there for my student on that campus, what kind of information can you share about your office, because that's important to figure out before you come to college. There are some students that come and think that they're going to get every single accommodation from high school, or think that every assignment is going to be tailored specifically for them. And then when they find out that maybe that isn't the case, they're like, well, no one told me. And often my office very kindly will say back, well, did you contact us? Did you call us to find this out ahead of time? So there's really no set time, other than I really do recommend reaching out to offices like mine, really by the end of the junior year, beginning of senior year, definitely before you come to campus. That way you can get any questions that you want answered, but you can also have enough time to get new documentation if that's needed. There's nothing worse than a student coming to campus that first week of campus and the first week of classes and saying, okay, I want my accommodations, but their documentation isn't what it needs to be. So definitely get that going ahead of time. Call and ask questions. I also encourage, I cannot impress this upon you enough as parents. Once your student leaves high school, they are considered the adult on a college campus. I never shy away from speaking with parents. I'll talk to parents all day long. I am a parent. I have 2 children of my own, one going to college, one going to middle school. I get it. I'm there with you. But we build the rapport with the student. So encourage your students to reach out to us, because we're going to be making appointments with them and speaking with them. Parents can always be part of the process, but it's really important for students to have their voice heard too and ask their own questions. All right, We've talked about documentation. You hear that word. I say it often. It's part of my daily jargon. Documentation. What kinds of documentation will my student need to provide in order to start the accommodation process? Again, that is so individual. It depends case by case by case by case. What works for one student doesn't work for another student. The general rule of thumb is that documentation really should not be older than 3 to 5 years. Anything beyond 5 years, you are a different student. You know, if you're an 18, 19-year-old student, if you give me documentation that was previous to 5 years, you're 13, 12, 13 years old. You're a totally different student profile. So we like documentation to be current. Documentation needs to clearly state the student's name, needs to clearly state the diagnosis, needs to clearly state what are the functional limitations of the diagnosis, meaning how does this diagnosis impact your student's academic experience? And then lastly, the documentation needs to make college appropriate recommendations. So it's like a box, you're tying everything together. Who is your student? What do they struggle with? How can we help support them? What should we put in place? Documentation, we have a whole guideline to it. If you go to our website and you look under the student resources tab, there's a whole tab that says documentation guidelines, and it gives you a breakdown of everything I just said, and also goes into detail about the different kinds of documentation we're looking on based on different diagnoses. What works for someone with a medical disability might not work for someone that has a learning disability. So it's important to kind of look at that and figure out, okay, who do I go to for documentation? Again, you can call my office anytime and we'll talk through options with you. We want to make this as easy as a transition as possible. All right, moving on to, this is a big one, accommodations. Are there accommodations for this? What kind of accommodations can my student get for that? And again, going back to my previous slide, it all depends on documentation. So long as you have a clear diagnosis with how it impacts your student's academic experience on a college campus and the recommendations made, we can talk about accommodations. There are so many accommodations for so many different disabling conditions. It's hard to pinpoint them all. On our campus at WPI, the most common accommodations are testing accommodations, extended time, the use of a calculator for a math-based learning disability, the use of a word processor to type out your answers if you have things such as dysgraphia or dyscalculia. We have a lot of accommodations put in place for classroom access to students that need to be in an accessible room, access to an accessible table, access to an elevator so they don't have to take the stairs up and down. We have housing accommodations that we put in place for students, a de-lofted bed, access to a single or a double room. And again, all of these accommodations are put in place based on the documentation that is provided to our office. We don't just assign accommodations. We really need to have the documented need for it. Plus we obviously meet with the student and learn about their lived experience too. And we kind of piece all of that together. But really to keep the student protected under the law, to keep my office protected under the law, we just need it to be in a documented form. So that way it's vetted basically. So really accommodations are on a case-by-case basis, and it's all part of the process, the intake process, and getting to know our office and what we can and cannot support. I think that's it for that. All right, adulting, here's a big one. Question number 5, how can the student prepare to manage their own accommodated needs and supports? Self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is key. Jumping from, like I said, high school to college seems manageable for a lot of students, but for some students it's really difficult. They're coming from a high school setting where they have parents or caregivers or people that have done a tremendous amount of advocacy work for that student. And then once they come to college, those supports are not there anymore, and their voice is the advocacy. They are the adult now, seeking out the kinds of accommodations that they'd like to be put in place, or the kind of office supports that they need to be academically successful. So I say this all the time, every intake appointment that I have with students, every parent that I talk to, I will always include the student in my conversations, always. I want students to feel like our office is approachable. I want students to know that we're a friendly group of people that are here to answer their questions. It sounds so old-fashioned, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. No question is a stupid question. I really want students to realize that their voice needs to be heard and that it matters. Their voice carries weight on campus. They are their own best self-advocates. And so how my office helps with that is we meet with students and we talk a lot about self-advocacy. Are your needs being met? How are you approaching your professor if you're having a hard time understanding what they're asking of you? How are you navigating group projects if you feel nervous or shy and you don't know how to stick up for yourself? So we, myself and my two colleagues, Jess and Taylor, we do a lot of work with students about how to use their voice, and then we're kind of like the sounding board about like, yes, that sounds great, or maybe reword this, or maybe think about this option. So that's my best advice, is empower your student to use their voice as often as possible. Encourage them to reach out to the office to ask the questions. Encourage them to call us. It's easy to rely on your parents, but it's really great when students reach out to us too. All right, parenting. This one's a hard one sometimes. How involved will I, the parents, be with the students' interactions with accessibility services? Again, it all depends. I'm very warm and welcoming to parents. As I said, I shared I am a parent and I understand. I won't shy away from speaking to parents during the intake process, during the question asking process. How do I accommodate this? How do I accommodate that? What's documentation? Now that we've moved a lot online due to COVID, many of my intake meetings, there's a student sitting in front of me, but I can see them turning because I know a parent is sitting over here. So I always welcome people into the phone call. I'm okay. I think parents have a valid voice. You know your child better than anybody else. But once school starts, once classes kick in, I really like to build that rapport with students. I will never shove a parent away, but I will always deflect back to the student. Sometimes I get parents, you know, don't tell my son or daughter that I emailed you, and that just puts my office in such an awkward position, because these are the people that we're, you know, these are the students that we're building rapport with. We want to build strong foundational relationships with them so that they feel comfortable to meet with us, comfortable to ask us questions, and not feel like we're, you know, talking about them behind their back with their parent. So parents are involved, but I also respectfully ask parents to realize that your student is newly navigating this and that we are professionals in the field and that we are here to help them. So I guess my best advice is parent as best as you know how. Obviously, you love your children, you want them to do well, but also trust us in the process too, that we care very deeply for the students that we work with and that we're here to help them. All right. Professors, moving from parents to professors. How will my students' professors know that the student has approved accommodations? Simple. At the beginning of every term, A term, B term, C term, D term, students are asked to send accommodation letters to their professors. It's all done electronically. We share this process with students during the intake process. It's literally, it's logging online and clicking off a bunch of check marks and hitting a submit button. It's a very intuitive process. That's how professors, there's a letter that's generated, it gets emailed to the professors, the student can tell if the professors read it, you can go online and say that it's been previewed. That's how professors find out that the student has accommodations. Can professors refuse to provide my student with officially approved accommodations? No, they cannot refuse. Sometimes professors do ask students, do you think you need the extra time? Or this exam is honestly only a half an hour long and I'm giving students the whole hour and a half to finish it. Do you think you need the extra time? And I think that professors come and say these things out of a place of caring because they're used to the work, they're used to doing things this way for so many years. But the student has every right to say, yes, I need my extended time. Yes, I need a laptop to take notes. Yes, I need to record your lecture. That's what my office is here to advocate for. I have not yet, thankfully, met too many professors that get kind of sticky with these things. It does happen sometimes, but that's where students would come to us and we would help them advocate, and we would advocate on their behalf, but also help them advocate for themselves as well. But the simple answer to that is no. Once an accommodation is approved through my office, it is theirs for, it is for the student for the entire time that they're at WPI, and a professor cannot simply say no to it. Simple as that. Resources. Is the Office of Accessibility Services the only place a student with accommodated needs can seek support? No. My office is where students come for classroom, campus, and housing accommodated needs. But there are so many other options on campus. There's the Academic Resource Center for tutoring. There's the Math and Science Help, it's called MASH, for group tutoring. Every single department, academic department on campus has their own kind of support system. They have their own tutoring sessions. Professors have their open office hours. We have the Career Development Center where students can go and seek support for job searching. How do I disclose for an internship? How do I disclose once I'm out in the job? What kind of resources do I need? We also have the Student Development and Counseling Center, which kind of helps navigate the counseling side of accommodations for students. So there's a lot of places to seek help on campus. It's just a matter of finding it. And that's why I like to say that my office is kind of like triage. Come to us first, just get your feet wet. You know, once students come to WPI, it's overwhelming where to turn. If they don't know where to turn, come to us and we'll point them in the right direction. If we can help them, we will, but if not, we've got no ego. We're not trying to steal thunder from other offices. We will point them in the right direction so that they are best serviced. That was kind of a long-winded answer, but there's a ton of support. You just have to know where to go to find it. And that was it. All right, so that was my spiel. Those are the most frequently asked questions that I see, and now I'd like to open it up to the group because I know that all of you are nervous, maybe a little bit about your student coming to college someday, and if you have questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can.
Thank you, Amy. That was a lot of really great information, and I feel like you might need to take a sip of water right about now.
I'm good, I'm good.
We do have a couple questions coming through, and if I go through and I miss yours, please just put it in the chat again, or some people are sending me private messages. So
okay.
One question we have is, my student is in the summer course, taking Frontiers for Credit, obviously right now, and has an IEP at school. They haven't submitted the form or asked for accommodations for this course. Can we still ask and submit for accommodations?
That all depends. To be perfectly honest, I say that for anyone that's in the, obviously you're on the Frontiers, your students are all in the Frontiers program. The first thing first is to figure out, are the exams in that class timed? Because some professors are giving students the whole day to finish an exam. Sometimes professors are giving students 4 hours to finish a 45-minute long exam. If that's the case, you don't necessarily need to put the accommodation in place because the professor's already built in that extended time. If your student is worried about extended time, time is of the essence. We are happy to work with Frontier students. We're happy to put accommodations in place for them, but it needs to happen as soon as possible just because it takes time. We are not only working with Frontier students, this is a tremendously busy time in my office, welcoming in the matriculated first year class and dealing with housing accommodations and all classroom accommodations, not to mention pandemic. So we're tremendously busy right now, but if your student does feel like they need accommodations for an upcoming exam, please, please, please have them send in the online intake form as soon as they possibly can. So that way we can reach out to them.
All right. And can you just remind us of where they can find that online intake form?
Sure. So if you do a Google search, literally, this is what you put into your search bar, WPI OAS for the Office of Accessibility Services. You're going to come to my main webpage, and then you scroll down a little bit, and there's a little tab that says Student Resources. When you click on Student Resources, it's the very top link. It literally says Online Intake Form, and then that brings you up. Students will need to log into that using their WPI credentials. It's a simple form. It literally takes just a few minutes to fill in. You're uploading your documentation to that. Once your student submits that, they'll get an auto response back from my office saying, thank you for submitting your form. If for some reason you don't get the auto response, it just means there was a glitch in the system because there might have been someone sending it in at the same time. And then you can just reach out to us and we'll send you a PDF version of the form.
Okay, great. And I actually, just to tell everyone who's on the call, I had put that link in the chat a little bit earlier in this conversation, so it should
okay.
be. Another question that was actually emailed to us earlier today. My child has Crohn's disease, and they are wondering what kind of accommodations you could provide, if this is something your office can work with. And some things might be the student experiences fatigue and maybe needs a room closer to the bathroom or a double instead of a triple.
Yeah, so that all depends. Yes, we have several students that have Crohn's disease, so your student is not alone. There are several accommodations we can put in place, but again, that all goes back to documentation. So in this case, you would need a medical provider because it's a medical disability. A medical provider to send us documentation that speaks to how will your child struggle on campus? How will they struggle academically based in Crohn's disease? How will they struggle in a living environment? Some common accommodations would be, like you said, possibly access to a semi-private bathroom, access to a single or a double as opposed to a triple. Some classroom accommodations for that would be access to food and drink if they're not feeling well in the classroom, extended time on exams if they need to get up and use the bathroom frequently. So there are accommodations that can be put in place. It just depends on what the documentation says.
Okay. And similarly, we had a question regarding diabetes and accommodations. I would imagine it would be this.
Yep, very similar. The biggest one for diabetes I find is access to food and drink in the classroom setting and the lab setting. We're going to go way back to the beginning of what I was saying about preferential seating, how that's more of a high school thing. I see a lot of that for our students with diabetes, only because in certain labs, having food and drink in that lab space is just not possible. But because that's an accommodated need, we need to make sure the student can sit in a certain area, maybe closer to the door, further away from some lab products that can't have food or drink near them. So we definitely work with the student, we work with the professor to make it possible. But yeah, there are accommodations for students with diabetes too. Again, extended time for exams if they need to monitor their blood sugar, or sometimes thinking about how they're placing their classes. You know, we would encourage students to work with their academic advisor so that maybe they're not taking back-to-back classes, that they have food breaks in there too. So yes, there are accommodations for that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Another question had to do with documentation.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that it can go back as far as 5 years. So if you have documentation from 8th grade, is that sufficient, or would the student need?
Honestly, it all depends on what accommodations you're asking for. Pretty much that's what it boils down to. So yes, if it falls within 5 years, yes, but once I look at what accommodations are being asked for, if they are not ones that can happen in a college setting, I will absolutely be honest with your student and say, I have this documentation, but the accommodations are speaking to like access to a learning resource center for 45 minutes twice a week, or access to only being able to take one test per day or extensions on all assignments. I mean, these are things we can work on, but they just look differently in a high school setting, also as in a college setting too, especially at WPI, just because things move at warp speed on our campus due to the term-based system. It's a big adjustment for a lot of students. You know, you're coming from a high school setting where you can say, hey, I need extensions on these assignments. But at WPI, sometimes that's just not possible because we only have 7 weeks. Every 7 weeks, you're moving classes. So things move rapidly. So that's why I say it all goes back to documentation and the validity of the documentation. What are the accommodations being asked for? Do they make sense on a college campus?
And this one came in, but I think it was a late arrival, so you might have covered this, but if not, okay, we can just touch base on it again.
Sure.
My student is shy and I don't know that she will reach out to your office. Am I able to set up the meeting for her?
Sure. Students and parents can set up meetings for students for the intake, but as meaning like, how do we look at documentation, sign you up for your accommodations, send your accommodation letters out. Parents can set that up, but students need to do it. Like, I can't have an intake with a parent. The student needs to be part of that process, because what I'm showing them to do, they're logging into their own student profile. So it's uncomfortable when it's just a parent, because I'm showing the parent how to do that, but I'm not seeing the student understand how to do it too. As far as setting up appointments to meet with us once they're on campus, that would have to come from your student. I don't regularly make appointments via parent. I mean, that's all part of adulting. Going back to that adulting slide, it's definitely hard, but I can promise you from the bottom of my heart, we're a very friendly group of people that right from the get-go, I hope students feel that when they first start to speak with us. I do a lot of outreach with students the first like 2 or 3 weeks that they're on campus. How are you? Or do you want to meet with us? This is how you reach out to us. Have you gone to this? Are you doing that? So students will get used to hearing from me, and hopefully that'll entice them in. Oh.
That sounds great. So my daughter would like a single dorm room. Can I request that through you?
Yeah, and again, it all depends on documentation. All depends on the documented need for it. My office is part of a housing accommodation committee. I do not make housing accommodation decisions solely on my own. It's too much to ask of one person. So it's my office, it's counseling services, health services, dining services, dean of students, residential services. There's an advocate from each of those offices. We meet all together to go over documentation and figure out what is doable, what is not. There is a tremendous amount of students that reach out to us and say, I need a single, but provide no documentation whatsoever. So there's a difference between an accommodated need versus a preference. We can talk about accommodated needs. Do you have a medical diagnosis? Do you have a physical limitation? What is it about living in a residence hall that you are physically, emotionally unable to live with another person versus a preference? So it's all a big conversation. But that being said, we do accommodate a tremendous amount of students with accommodated housing. So it's not like it's unheard of on campus. It just all comes down to documentation.
Great. I think that is all the questions I have on our chat.
Okay.
We can give it a moment, and if anybody has any last minute questions you want to type in, we'd be happy to take those. Otherwise, we'll let you go enjoy your evening. But we'll in.
All right.
A lot, you know, it's a lot to think about, and it's really great to have this information while students are juniors and seniors in high school, that you know what to expect and you can be prepared.
Yes, obviously, like, you know who I am. I'm at WPI, so you know who to contact here. But if your students are looking at other schools, I cannot say it enough. Call the other offices of the other schools you're looking at and just figure out what the process is. How far in advance do they need the documentation? What is their intake process like? Many offices will not tell you, yes, I can guarantee those accommodations. Yes, we have that accommodation for this, because it is so dependent on what documentation you are sending to us. We're just following the best practices and guidelines of the law. So it's just important to kind of hash that information out ahead of time, so therefore there are no surprises or disappointments or shocking information once your student starts campus.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, it seems like all of the questions have been answered.
Excellent.
So I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
And I would like to thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you.